Section number 60 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA. Book number 8, Chapter 15, Spheres of Action, Blasphemy. Blasphemy is a somewhat elastic term, but for our purpose it may, in a general way, be defined as imprecation derogatory or insulting to the divinity. Punished with lapidation under the Levitical law, it was, during the Middle Ages, the subject of infinite legislation, both on the part of secular and ecclesiastical lawgivers, and savage punishments, such as boring the tongue with a hot wire, were frequently imposed. Henrique IV, in 1462, prescribed cutting out the tongue, together with scourging or banishment, and in 1476 Ferdinand and Isabella confirmed this. Jurisdiction over blasphemy was cumulative, belonging both to the secular and spiritual courts, and was also within the cognizance of the old Inquisition, provided it was heretical, but the distinction between non-heretical and heretical was not easy. Emmerich tells us that imprecations reviling God or the Virgin, or expressing ingratitude to him, are simple blasphemy, with which the Inquisition has no concern. To give it cognizance, there must be a denial of some article of faith, and the repetition of this definition by the Repertorium in 1494 shows that this continued to be accepted as the rule in practice. The Spanish Inquisition, at its inception, thus found itself possessed of jurisdiction, and in Aragon at least, where the institution had the tradition of centuries, there was no hesitation in exercising it, immediately after the reorganization. In the Saragossa auto of December 17, 1486, there appeared a Christian punished for blasphemy, his tongue being pierced with a stick, and a Jew with a bridle in his mouth, a mitre and a straw espuria. In this field, as in so many others, inquisitional zeal outran discretion. There was little attention paid to the distinction between heretical and non-heretical, and, in the Instructions of 1500, inquisitors were told that they made arrests for trifling matters, not directly heretical, as for words uttered in anger that were blasphemy and not hearsay. In future no one was to be arrested for such things, and if there was doubt, the Inquisitor General was to be consulted. This warning was all the more needed, as the secular courts were not ready to abandon their jurisdiction, for a pragmatica of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1502 provides lashes, prison, and other penalties for blasphemies so evidently heretical as Decreto de Dios, I disbelieve in God. The bishops likewise continued to assert control, for the Council of Seville, in 1512, under ex-Inquisitor General Deza, imposed a fine of 3 gold florins and imprisonment at discretion on clerics, while for laymen, in addition to the legal penalties, the ecclesiastical judge was directed to prosecute for swearing, blasphemy, or insults to God, the Virgin, and the saints. The caution enjoined in the Instructions of 1500 was lost on the inquisitors and their abuse of power. In the respect, suggested one of the complaints of the Cortes of Monzon in 1510. In the Concordia of 1512 it was provided they should not have the cognizance of blasphemy, unless it manifestly savored of hearsay, such as denying the existence of God or his omnipotence. Inquisitor General Cadier embodied this in his Introductions of 1514, and Leo X confirmed it, in 1516, in his bull Pastoris Officii. The Aragonese Suprema accepted this and, in the Edict of Faith of 1515, it was specially stated that denunciation of blasphemy was not required, except when it was contrary to articles of faith. As we have seen in bigamy, however, no attention was paid to this, and among the grievances of the Cortes about 1530 there is complaint that the Inquisition threw into prison orthodox persons for blasphemy and for words merely uttered in the heat of passion, to which the imperturbable Inquisitor General replied that the inquisitors acted only in accordance with the law, and if the parties had been aggrieved, let their names be given, where due provision would be made. These troubles were by no means confined to Aragon. In Castile, a royal pragmatica of 1515 recites a supplication to the king asking that inquisitors should not have cognizance of blasphemy, wherefore it was ordered that they should only hear cases which they could and ought to hear, and a special charge was given to the Inquisitor General not to permit them to do otherwise, and to provide that abuses, if such there were, should cease. This ambiguous utterance naturally provided no effect and, in 1534, the Cortes of Madrid represented forcibly the hardship that a blasphemy, uttered in the excitement of gambling or in the passion of a quarrel, should expose a man, noble and pure blood, to arrest by the Inquisition, when, as the cause was not known, the whole lineage suffered infamy. They asked, therefore, that the offence should be remanded exclusively to the secular courts, which should punish it rigorously. To this Charles evasively replied that the judges would execute the laws and the inquisitors would not exceed their powers, and he contented himself with reissuing the Pragmatica of 1515. It is easy to appreciate the feelings underlying these remonstrances. Where there was no function of the Inquisition which brought it more fully in contact with the mass of the old Christian population, thoroughly orthodox at heart, strict in observance, proud of purity of blood, and dreading nothing so much as the nota incurred by the slightest suspicion of heresy. The Spaniard was choleric, and not especially nice in his choice of words when moved by wrath. Gambling was an almost universal passion, and in all lands and ages nothing has been more provocative of ejaculations and expletives than the vicissitudes of cards and dice. What, to women in the humbler walks of life, were the prosecutions for sorcery, those for blasphemy were to men of all ranks. Trivial as this portion of inquisitorial activity may seem to us, we may feel sure that in no other way was the influence of the Holy Office more keenly felt or more dreaded by that great body of the nation which zealously welcomed its persecution of the Jewish and Moorish New Christians. It is true that, in theory, the jurisdiction of the Inquisition was confined to heretical blasphemy and, if the older definitions were observed, only a moderate self-restraint was required for the most inveterate gambler or hot-headed ruffler to keep on the safe side. But definitions were malleable and could be molded to suit the temper or the aggressiveness of a tribunal anxious for business and for fines. The doctors found it no easier to agree upon the delimitation of heretical blasphemy than upon the thousand other questions suggested by moral theology. It was easy to say in general terms that heretical blasphemy consisted in affirming or denying of God that which the faith requires to be denied or affirmed, or in attributing to the creature that which pertains solely to the Creator, but when it came to applying these abstract principles in the concrete, there were apt to be discordance, and it is easy to imagine how ample a field for casuistry was afforded by the variety, vigour, and picturesqueness of the blasphemy of the southern races. As a rule, the Suprema was inclined to check the readiness of the tribunals to discover heresy in expletives which were, it is true, blasphemous, irreverent, and indecent, but not indicative of lack of faith. There was a class of these, which seemed to have been in the mouth of everyone, ineradicable by the most severe legislation, such as malgrado a Dios, may it spite God; pes a Dios, may God regret; renio a Dios, I renounce God; descreo de Dios, I disbelieve in God, etc., for which Ferdinand and Isabella, in their laws of 1492 and 1502, provided penalties ranging from a month's imprisonment for a first offence to piercing the tongue for a third, and in 1525 Charles V added por vida de Dios, by God's life, to the list. In 1566 Philip II, in his desire for naval recruits, added 10 years of galleys to the penalties for blasphemy and 6 years of galleys to the tongue piercing for the third offence, as provided by his predecessors. When these offences were so fully covered by secular law, the Suprema deemed it unnecessary that the tribunals should be diverted from their legitimate functions to take cognizance of them. In 1537 Dr. Giron de Lousea, in his Visitation of Toledo, writes for instructions concerning these expletives. He regards them as heretical, but he understands that the Suprema does not wish the tribunals to take action on them, as they are so common and they are already judges enough for them. It was probably in response to this that, in the same year 1537, the Suprema decided that utterances such as these were not within its jurisdiction, because they were conditional, being merely explosions of wrath or disappointment, a decision which it repeated in 1547. It had already, in 1535, construed the instructions of 1500 as implying that sudden ejaculations of anger were to be handed over to the episcopal courts and, in 1560, it included por vida de Dios among non-heretical blasphemies. In 1567, however, among the charges against Estevan Pollo in Valencia is included his exclaiming pes a Dios, and the tendency of inquisitors to widen the definition is seen in the rebuke by the Suprema of the Inquisitor Moral, because in San Sebastian he had punished for saying such as God cannot do me more harm, and in this world you will not see me suffer, unless indeed it sagely observes the last expression is used with disbelief in the final judgment. This latter remark illustrates the ingenious casuistry with which heresy could be discovered whenever desirable, of which we have already seen an example in the case of Antonio Perez, for one of the charges against him was his swearing that, if God the Father interfered with his defence, he would cut off his nose, in which Fray Diego de Chaves found savour of the heresy of the Vadoy who attributed human members to God. It is possible that the successful employment against Perez of the jurisdiction over blasphemy may have led to a more liberal definition of heresy, for in the 17th century we find a consensus of opinion that such expletives as reino de Dios, or de la fe, or de la crisma, or de Nuestra Senora, or decreo de Dios were heretical. Whether this applied to renouncing St. Peter, St. Paul, and other saints was a more doubtful question, on which the doctors differed. There were even strict constructionalists who held that to call God all wise or all beautiful as a lover might address his mistress was blasphemy. In Sicily the exclamation Sanctus Diabolus was usually admitted to be heretical, but it was not prosecuted because it was so universally used that it was more convenient to class it as simple blasphemy. It will readily be seen how elusive were the questions arising from the variegated ingenuity of blasphemers, and what scope there was for the indulgence of temperamental idiosyncrasies among inquisitors. In the region so full of doubt, where there were three claimants of jurisdiction, the secular, the spiritual, and the inquisitorial, much clashing might naturally be expected, but I have not met with any competencias with the royal courts arising from this source. In his anxiety to suppress blasphemy, Philip IV in 1639 assembled a junta to consider whether the jurisdiction of the Inquisition could not be enlarged, so that it could punish the utterance of a single por vida, when the outcome of its deliberations was a comprehensive decree punishing all swearing, save in judicial procedures, with a graduated scale of penalties, and those addicted to the habit were incapacitated for holding office under the state. Of course this was ineffective, and in 1655 and 1656 he ordered the rigid infliction of the punishment in order to disarm the divine indignation manifested in the public misfortunes. Neither did the episcopal courts surrender their jurisdiction, and it proves the ineradicable character of the offence that it continued to flourish in spite of persecution by all three. A case illustrative of their cumulative action and of the susceptibility of Spanish piety was that of Diego Cabeza of Manzanal de la Puente, who, about 1620, in quarrelling with a man, said that he did not know what God was about when he made him. The local magistrate, Francisco Prieto, exacted of him a fine of 40 ducats, by threatening to denounce him to the Inquisition, but the episcopal court heard of the matter, arrested, tried and punished him. Then, some 10 years later, in 1630, he was denounced to the Valladolid tribunal. The calificador's duty pondered over his utterance and pronounced it to be a heretical blasphemy, but when the inquisitors learnt that it was 10 years old and that he had already been punished by the episcopal ordinary, they wisely suspended the case. Presumably it was the worst cases of blasphemy that came before the Inquisition, and as a rule its moderation offers a favorable contrast to the savage ferocity of secular legislation. It is true that, as suspicion of heresy was inferred, the accused was thrown in the secret prison, which, in itself, was a severe infliction, but torture was not employed. The penalties prescribed were abjuration de levi, appearance in an auto, gagging, scourging and galleys, according to the gravity of the offence, while frailes were recluded in convents of their own orders. These, however, were reserved for aggravated cases of habitual blasphemy by offenders of low degree. Nobles and gentlemen had their sentences read in the audience chamber, were excused from abjuration, and were recluded in a monastery for some months. Outbreaks of passion, in quarrels or gambling and even drunkenness, were held to entitle the accused to acquittal, or to merely nominal penalties. A writer of about 1640 indeed assumes a rule that the culprit was only reprimanded in the audience chamber without abjuration, except in very scandalous cases. deserving of scourging and the galleys, but even in those such punishments were no longer inflicted. There was no sequestration of property, and repetition of the offence was not regarded as relapse. A later writer, however, holds that such heretical blasphemies as Reino de Dios, Descreto de Dios, and the like are punishable with vergüenza, or 100 lashes. It may be assumed, in fact, that there was a wide discretion in these matters. We have seen the severity with which the wild outbreaks of rage of Antonio Perez were treated, yet, in 1624, a young soldier who, when put in the stocks, exclaimed, "I renounce God and the saints. Devils, why don't you come and carry me off?" when duly tried with all formality by the Valladolid tribunal, was discharged with a reprimand and without a sentence. So, in 1630, two girls in the Dominican convent of Valladolid, on being confined in a room by the prioress, in a burst of rage repeatedly renounced God and the saints. Naturally, on trial they expressed extreme repentance and were discharged with a reprimand. This wise moderation did not exclude severity, when the case seemed to demand it. In 1669, Antonio de Hiro, for heretical blasphemy in grado superlativo, was sentenced in Toledo to appear in the auto of April 7th, to abjure de levi, to hear mass as a penitent, to receive 100 lashes, and to serve 3 years in the galleys. Considering the prevalence of the vice and the energetic efforts for its suppression, the number of cases in the Inquisition is less than might be expected. In the Toledo record from 1575 to 1610 there are only 46. In that same tribunal from 1648 to 1794 the number is but 37. In all the tribunals from 1780 to 1820 the total is 147. It is evident that, in this matter, the activity of the Inquisition diminished greatly as time wore on, whether from an increase in popular reverence, or from a growing disinclination to denounce the offence. End of the section number 60. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.